Imagine looking up at the sky and instead of raindrops, you see fish, hundreds of them, falling like some kind of absurd, aquatic hailstorm. Or picture an entire town, not gradually submerged by rising waters, but suddenly lifted from its foundations and carried away on a bizarre, swirling current. These aren't scenes from a fantasy novel or a surreal dream. They're real moments from American history, moments when nature didn't just misbehave, it seemed to rewrite the rules entirely. Floods are typically thought of as tragic, destructive forces, but sometimes they unfold in ways so strange, so utterly unexpected, that they border on the unbelievable. What if I told you that some of the most jaw-dropping, head-scratching stories of flooding don't come from hurricanes or tsunamis, but from events so peculiar you'll struggle to believe they actually happened? Welcome, everyone. Today, we're setting out on a journey through some of the most bizarre and astonishing flood stories ever recorded right here in the United States. We're not talking about your average overflowed river or seasonal storm surge. Oh no. We're diving into tales where the water didn't just rise. It seemed to have a mind of its own, creating scenarios so weird they sound like they were pulled straight from folklore. From fish raining down from the heavens to towns vanishing under circumstances that defy logic, these events challenge everything we think we know about floods. They're reminders that nature, in all its raw power, is still capable of delivering surprises that leave even experts scratching their heads in wonder. So why explore these strange and often overlooked chapters of history? Because hidden within these unusual events are stories of human resilience, curiosity, and the sheer unpredictability of our world. Each flood we'll uncover is a testament to how ordinary communities faced the extraordinary and lived to tell some of the most fascinating tales you've ever heard. As we count down 31 of the weirdest flood stories across America, you'll discover that truth really can be stranger than fiction. So settle in, open your mind to the incredible, and let's dive into the astonishing, the peculiar, and the downright unbelievable world of America's most bizarre floods. Now, let's begin our journey with a story so bizarre it almost defies comprehension, a disaster where the threat wasn't water but sweetness itself. In the north end of Boston, on January 15, 1919, the unthinkable happened. A towering 50-foot-tall tank filled with more than 2.3 million gallons of molasses simply burst apart, but this was no slow, oozing leak. The failure was catastrophic and instantaneous, unleashing a monstrous wave of sticky, viscous syrup that did not pour, but rather exploded into the streets. This wasn't a gentle flow, it was a raging tsunami of molasses, estimated to be moving at an incredible 35 miles per hour. The force was absolutely devastating. It smashed entire buildings off their foundations, shattered the girders of the elevated railway, and swept horses, wagons, and people off their feet as if they were mere toys. The sheer weight and bizarre consistency of the flood created a terrifying situation where those caught in its path were not just drowned, but suffocated by the thick, impenetrable goo. In the end, 21 people lost their lives and another 150 were injured, in what remains one of the most surreal and tragic industrial accidents in American history. In the aftermath, rescue workers, police, and even the Red Cross waded through streets chest-deep in the substance, their boots sticking to the pavement with every step. The clean-up effort took weeks, using salt water from a fireboat to hose down the streets and wash the molasses into the harbor. And for decades after, Bostonians swore that on a hot summer day, the neighborhood still carried the faint, sweet smell of molasses, a haunting and permanent reminder of the day the city drowned in syrup. If the Great Molasses Flood felt like a freak accident, a bizarre twist of industrial fate, our next story returns us to the raw, untamed power of nature itself, a power that many had been warned about but few could truly fathom. Nestled in a valley surrounded by the Allegheny Mountains, Johnstown, Pennsylvania was a bustling steel town, home to thousands of hard-working families. Above them, however, sat a looming, neglected threat, the South Fork Dam, holding back the massive waters of Lake Conemaugh. For years, residents had expressed concern about the dam's structural integrity, but these warnings were largely dismissed. Then, on May 31, 1889, after a period of exceptionally heavy rain, the dam gave way. It didn't just break, it vanished, unleashing an unimaginable wall of water 20 million tons strong. This wasn't a flood, it was a tsunami roaring down the mountain valley at speeds of 40 miles per hour, and it would become one of the deadliest disasters in American history. But what makes the Johnstown flood truly eerie, placing it firmly in our countdown, are the strange premonitions and odd occurrences reported in the days leading up to the catastrophe. Some townspeople spoke of a deep, unexplained sense of dread they couldn't shake. Others reported unusual animal behavior, with livestock acting skittish and dogs howling incessantly for no apparent reason. Most hauntingly, several residents recounted vividly disturbing dreams of being swept away by a terrifying deluge, waking in a cold sweat just nights before the disaster struck. Whether these were mere coincidences or something more metaphysical, they contribute to the enduring, chilling legend of that day. The destruction was near total. The wall of water, packed with massive debris including entire railroad cars and barbed wire from factories, scoured the valley clean. It took just 10 minutes for the wave to reach Johnstown, and in those minutes, over 2,200 people lost their lives. The force was so immense that it is said the wave hit the stone bridge at the town's edge with the power of a meteorite impact, but the strangeness didn't end with the floodwaters. In the aftermath, as the debris piled against the bridge and caught fire, the disaster created its own self-contained weather system. The massive fire, fueled by the tangled wreckage of the town, generated so much heat and moisture that it began to form clouds right above the devastation. Survivors, already witnessing a scene from a nightmare, then watched as it began to rain, a ghostly, mournful drizzle falling from a clear sky onto the smoldering ruins of their homes and loved ones. This bizarre meteorological event, rain born from the fire of the flood's aftermath, served as a final, surreal punctuation to a catastrophe that seemed to defy the very laws of nature. While the rains pounded the eastern United States, a very different kind of water story was unfolding on the opposite coast, one that permanently reshaped not just the landscape but the very identity of a future megacity. To understand the sheer strangeness of the 1938 Los Angeles River flood, you first have to understand the river itself. For most of the year, it wasn't a river at all, but a wide, sandy, and mostly dry gulch, a convenient place for kids to play and for Hollywood to film westerns pretending it was some desert arroyo. This perception lured countless new residents into building homes and businesses right on its broad, seemingly harmless floodplain. They saw a ditch. Nature was about to show them a furious, churning expressway. The deluge began in late February and continued into March, a series of Pacific storms that dumped a year's worth of rain on the region in just a few days. The parched earth couldn't absorb it, and the gentle, sandy bed of the L.A. River was instantly overwhelmed. It transformed from a trickle to a terrifying, mile-wide torrent of muddy water, moving with such force that it didn't just overflow its banks, it completely erased them, carving brutal new channels straight through urban neighborhoods. This wasn't a flood, it was a geological event happening at breakneck speed, rewriting the map of Los Angeles in real time. Bridges that had stood for decades were swept away like twigs, and entire city blocks were simply scoured from existence. And then came the fish, as the raging waters finally began to recede, leaving behind a landscape of thick, oozing mud and unimaginable wreckage. Residents emerged to find a scene that bordered on the surreal. Strewn across their streets, lodged in the branches of trees, and left flapping in suburban backyards were hundreds of ocean creatures. The incredible force of the water rushing down from the mountains had surged all the way to the Pacific Ocean, churned up the seabed near the river's mouth, and then hauled its bizarre bounty back inland. People weren't just navigating around downed power lines and shattered cars. They were stepping over stranded sharks, skates, and entire flopping schools of saltwater fish miles from the coast. It was as if the ocean itself had made a violent, temporary incursion into the city, leaving behind these strange, dying souvenirs of its visit. The rescue efforts were as dramatic as the disaster itself, unfolding like a scene from an adventure film. With standard roads impassable, authorities commissioned a makeshift fleet of streetcars from the Pacific Electric Railway, boldly driving the heavy red cars directly through deep, flowing water to reach stranded thousands. Meanwhile, a legion of courageous volunteers took to the floodwaters in anything that would float: rowboats, canoes, even improvised rafts pulling people from second-story windows and rooftops. One particularly cinematic rescue involved a woman who went into labor amidst the chaos. A team of doctors and police managed to reach her by boat, delivering the baby safely by lantern light in her waterlogged home. In the end, the flood claimed over 100 lives and caused damages that would amount to billions of dollars today. Its most lasting legacy, however, was the complete reimagining of the Los Angeles River. The disaster proved that the harmless-looking wash was a sleeping giant, leading to the river's eventual total encasement in concrete, a monumental engineering project designed to prevent such a bizarre and deadly event from ever happening again. Just as the receding waters of Los Angeles revealed a bizarre marine graveyard, another American city was about to experience a flood so profound it would rewrite the book on urban disaster response, all under the eerie, flickering glow of an unearthly storm. In March of 1913, a perfect meteorological catastrophe descended upon the Midwest. 3 separate storm systems converged over Ohio, dumping a staggering volume of rain on already saturated ground. But it was the city of Dayton, built at the confluence of the Great Miami, Stillwater, and Mad Rivers, that found itself directly in the crosshairs. The rivers began to swell on Easter Sunday, March 23rd, but the true horror arrived in the dead of night. With a series of deafening roars, the levees containing the Great Miami River gave way, unleashing a wall of water 20 feet high that poured into the city's streets. This was not a gradual rising, but a violent, instantaneous invasion. Entire city blocks were submerged within minutes, trapping thousands of residents in their homes, forcing them to flee to the upper floors and ultimately to their rooftops as the icy, relentless water kept climbing. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the howling wind and the terrifying sounds of buildings groaning under the pressure before crumbling into the current. But then, something even more strange and terrifying began to happen. Above the churning, chaotic waters, the sky itself seemed to crackle and break. Brilliant, silent flashes of light, a phenomenon known as flood lightning, illuminated the nightmare scene. This wasn't the familiar fork lightning of a typical thunderstorm. It was a continuous, sheet-like electrical activity caused by the immense friction of water colliding with structures, churning up immense static charges in the atmosphere. For the terrified people clinging to their roofs, this surreal light show created a strobe-like effect, freezing moments of the disaster in stark, horrifying clarity. A house spinning slowly in the current, the desperate face of a neighbor across the street, the endless expanse of black water where their city used to be. When dawn finally broke, the scale of the destruction was beyond comprehension. But as rescue boats began to navigate the new, treacherous waterways that were once city streets, they encountered a scene of bizarre and almost darkly comic spectacle. Dayton's business district, now a fast-moving river, had become a surreal parade of the city's commercial life. Floating past were not just trees and wreckage, but the entire contents of storefronts and warehouses. Butchers saw their sides of beef bobbing merrily along in the current. Office workers watched hundreds of typewriters seemingly sailing in a silent, clumsy armada. The flood had raided a theater, sending costumed mannequins from a production of Alice in Wonderland on a macabre final voyage through the urban canals. Perhaps most symbolic of the chaos was the sight of thousands of eggs, liberated from a wholesale grocer, floating in a vast, sloshing blanket that gave sections of the water an oddly foamy, yellow appearance. This bizarre flotilla of everyday items, illuminated the night before by unearthly lightning, created an atmosphere of profound dislocation. It was as if the very soul of the city, its commerce, its culture, its industry, had been liquefied and set adrift. The response to this disaster, however, would cement Dayton's legacy. A local inventor named John H. Patterson, the head of the National Cash Register Company, turned his factory into the epicenter of the rescue and relief effort. He commandeered his company's fleet of trucks to form rescue convoys, used his factory's telegraph station to become the sole line of communication with the outside world, and even had his cafeteria bake bread around the clock to feed the stranded and displaced. His decisive, modern actions set a new standard for corporate responsibility and emergency management, proving that even in the face of such a weird and overwhelming disaster, human ingenuity and compassion could shine through. Yet for all the organized chaos of Dayton's streetcar rescues and floating eggs, it was a stark reminder that water respects no city limits, no human timetable. This truth would find a terrifying new expression half a century later, not in a dense industrial center but in the scenic valleys of the Black Hills. On the evening of June 9, 1972, the town of Rapid City, South Dakota, was enjoying a typical summer night. The weather had been stormy, but nothing out of the ordinary for the region. Then something went terribly wrong with the atmosphere itself. A stationary thunderstorm, a meteorological anomaly, parked itself directly over the Black Hills and began to dump rain at a rate that seemed to defy physics. In just 6 unimaginable hours, up to 15 inches of rain fell in some areas. This wasn't a storm that moved through. It was a monstrous, concentrated faucet in the sky, relentlessly pouring onto the same patch of land. The result was instant, catastrophic runoff. The steep, rocky terrain of the Black Hills, unable to absorb even a fraction of this deluge, funneled the water into a series of creeks that feed into Rapid Creek, which runs straight through the heart of Rapid City. What was normally a gentle stream swelled into a raging, half-mile-wide wall of water, mud, and debris that slammed into the city with little warning. The force was beyond anything anyone could have prepared for. It wasn't just water rising, it was the landscape itself turning into a liquid avalanche. The floodwave picked up everything in its path, but its treatment of the automobile, that symbol of American freedom, was especially surreal and destructive. As the water surged through the city, it didn't just float cars, it played with them like a giant, destructive child. The current collected vehicles into grotesque, tangled sculptures of steel and glass. When the waters finally receded, they left behind scenes of bizarre and heartbreaking absurdity. On the city's eastern edge, near a bend in the creek, a twisted pile of wrecked automobiles stood 3 stories high, a grotesque monument to the flood's raw power. Some cars were wrapped around trees like tinfoil. Others were deposited on rooftops, buried in mud up to their windows, or crumpled into impossible shapes and shoved inside buildings. The strangest spectacle was perhaps the fleet of cars that had been carried from a dealership's lot, never to be driven, now strewn across a muddy plain as if discarded by a petulant giant. This bizarre automotive graveyard became one of the most enduring and haunting images of the disaster, a starkly weird contrast to the natural beauty of the surrounding hills. The human cost was devastating, with 238 lives lost. Yet from this tragedy emerged a profound and lasting change in how America manages its floodplains. The widespread destruction of buildings constructed right on the creek's banks led to a revolutionary idea. Instead of rebuilding in the same dangerous places, the city would buy out the properties and return the land to nature. This created a sprawling, beautiful greenway through Rapid City, a permanent park that can safely absorb future floods. This forward-thinking response transformed a scene of surreal destruction into a national model for living in harmony with the unpredictable power of water. If the tragedy in Rapid City showed nature's power to toy with our machines, an earlier disaster in Pennsylvania demonstrated its ability to treat entire human dwellings with an almost casual, magical indifference. At the turn of the 20th century, the city of Austin was a booming hub for the lumber industry, its prosperity built on the vast forests of Potter County. To power its massive paper mill, the town's owners decided to harness the power of Freeman Run by constructing a massive dam. This was not some hastily built earthen barrier. The Austin Dam was a monumental structure for its time, built from solid granite and concrete. Its builders proclaimed it not just strong, but absolutely flood-proof, an immovable testament to human engineering that would stand against any force nature could muster. This towering confidence, however, would be shattered in the most literal sense imaginable. The autumn of 1900 had been exceptionally wet, and by the end of September, Freeman Run was swollen from weeks of persistent rain. The reservoir behind the mighty dam was filled to near capacity, a vast, placid lake hiding an incredible pent-up energy. Then, on the morning of September 30th, a final, intense downpour pushed the system past its breaking point. Workers at the paper mill below first noticed a small leak seeping from the dam's base. This trickle quickly grew into a spray, then a jet of water, eroding the earth behind the stone facade. The unthinkable began to happen. The immense hydraulic pressure from the entire lake started to lift the massive granite dam right off its foundation. With a roar that witnesses described as louder than any thunder, the entire central section of the flood-proof structure simply pivoted forward and then disintegrated, unleashing the entire lake in one single catastrophic pulse. What happened next was less a flood and more a localized tsunami. A wall of water estimated to be over 50 feet high exploded down the narrow valley toward the town of Austin, moving with a speed and violence that defied belief. It scoured the valley clean, obliterating the paper mill in an instant and then surging into the residential neighborhoods below. The force was sufficient to pluck entire houses, foundations and all, right from the earth. But here is where the story takes its truly bizarre and miraculous turn. Several of these homes with families huddled inside were not smashed to splinters. Instead, they were lifted intact by the enormous wave and carried along on its crest like a fleet of ungainly, terrifying boats. One particularly remarkable account tells of a woman who was in her kitchen when the world outside her window suddenly vanished, replaced by a churning brown fury. Her entire house was wrenched from its foundation and began to float, spinning slowly in the current. For a journey that lasted nearly 2 miles, she and her children rode inside this improvised ark as it was borne along on the flood wave. Furniture slid across floors, dishes crashed from cabinets, and the entire world outside was a maelstrom of water and debris. Yet, when the house finally came to rest, lodged against a hillside far downstream, the structure was largely intact and the family inside was shaken but completely unharmed. They simply opened their front door and stepped out into a world that had been utterly transformed, their home having sailed over the top of the destruction that claimed 122 other lives that day. This surreal phenomenon of houses sailing over the apocalypse with their inhabitants surviving unscathed stands as one of the most strangely merciful and utterly bizarre episodes in the history of American disasters. But if the idea of houses sailing safely over a flood wave stretches the limits of belief, our next story takes the surreal spectacle to an almost continental scale, redefining what it means to live with a river that has a will of its own. The Mississippi River flood of 1927 wasn't just a disaster, it was a wholesale reordering of the American South, a biblical-scale event that submerged an area larger than some entire states. For months, spring rains had pounded the central United States, swelling the Mississippi and its tributaries to levels never before recorded. The entire river system was a bloated, pressurized monster, held in check only by a network of levees that engineers nervously hoped would hold. They did not. Beginning in April, the levees began to fail, one after another, sometimes dynamited on purpose in desperate attempts to save larger cities downstream, sometimes bursting on their own with catastrophic force. When the great river finally broke free, it didn't just flood the land, it invented a new inland sea 27,000 square miles wide. The sheer scale of the inundation created scenes so bizarre they seemed lifted from a fever dream. In the cotton-growing delta regions of Mississippi and Arkansas, the endless, flat fields vanished beneath a shimmering, brown expanse of water that stretched to the horizon. This created an utterly surreal new reality for transportation. The very steamboats that normally chugged along the river's main channel, their paddle wheels pushing against a strong current, now found themselves gliding silently and effortlessly over what had been dry land just days before. Farmers who had spent their lives plowing those fields now stood on the decks of these vessels, looking down through clear water at the tops of their own submerged fence posts and the ghostly rows of young cotton plants waving beneath the surface like aquatic weeds. These steamboats became the lifelines of the disaster, cruising not on a river but across a vast temporary ocean, delivering supplies to isolated communities and rescuing survivors from rooftops and treetops. And it was in those treetops that another layer of strange reality took hold. As the water rose relentlessly, swallowing entire towns and plantations, high ground became the most precious commodity in the world. For the thousands of people and animals trapped by the flood, the only refuge was often the highest point available, the dense, canopied tops of mature groves. These clusters of trees became bizarre, teeming islands of life in a muddy sea. Families crowded onto hastily built platforms lashed between branches, creating entire aerial villages where they would live for weeks on end. Below them, the limbs were thick with every manner of creature driven to the same desperate sanctuary. Snakes coiled on lower branches, livestock that had swum to safety stood belly deep in water, and flocks of birds competed for space. The sounds were a constant, chaotic mix of human voices, crying children, the lowing of distressed cows, and the hissing of snakes, all set against the backdrop of the silent, oppressive water. One particularly vivid account describes a rescuer piloting a small boat through a pecan orchard, the tips of the trees just brushing the surface, and hearing a child's laugh echo from above. Looking up, he saw an entire extended family living on a series of broad planks nailed across the sturdy limbs, with a grandmother calmly stirring a pot over a small, carefully managed fire built in a washtub. This was the profound and weird duality of the flood. It was both a bringer of unimaginable destruction and a creator of these strange, isolated micro-communities where the normal rules of society were suspended, and survival depended on a new kind of ingenuity. The flood's aftermath permanently altered the relationship between the American people and their greatest river, leading to the most ambitious federal flood control project in the nation's history and shifting the political landscape of the South, proving that even the most bizarre and destructive events can leave a legacy of profound change. While the Mississippi flood was a slow-moving cataclysm unfolding over months, some of the most bewildering deluges arrive with the sudden, concentrated fury of a single, impossible storm. Such was the case in the hill country of Texas in September of 1921, an event that would shatter rainfall records and bend the very laws of hydrology. The stage was set by a stalled tropical system that drew a seemingly endless supply of moisture from the Gulf of Mexico, funneling it directly over the city of Taylor and the surrounding watersheds. The rain began unremarkably, but it did not stop. For hours it fell, then for a full day, a relentless, deafening downpour that turned the sky a perpetual shade of leaden gray. When the clouds finally parted, the numbers were almost incomprehensible. In just 24 hours, the town of Thrall had been pummeled by an official 38.2 inches of rain, a record for a single day in the United States that would stand for decades. In some localized spots, estimates suggested over 40 inches had fallen. To put that in perspective, it was more water than many desert cities see in a decade, all arriving in one terrifying day. This unimaginable volume of water had nowhere to go. The rocky, clay-heavy soil of the region was instantly saturated, turning every slope into a liquid chute funneling torrents into the creeks and rivers below. The Guadalupe River, normally a peaceful waterway meandering through the scenic hills, underwent a transformation of biblical proportions. It didn't just rise, it exploded from its banks, swallowing entire communities in a churning, coffee-colored rage. But the most mind-bending effect of this unprecedented influx of water wasn't just how high the river rose, but the direction in which it decided to flow. The incredible force of the floodwaters surging into the Guadalupe from its overwhelmed tributaries created a hydraulic anomaly so rare it seems like a geographic tall tale. For a brief, surreal period, the Guadalupe River actually flowed backward. The immense pressure of the water pouring into its channel from the side was so great that it overpowered the river's natural gradient and current, forcing it to reverse its course and push upstream. This phenomenon, known to hydrologists as reversal, is a testament to an almost unimaginable force. For the residents witnessing it, it was a sight that defied all logic and experience, a visceral, frightening sign that the natural order had been completely upended. The river they knew, with its established direction and behavior, had simply ceased to exist, replaced by a chaotic inland tidal wave that obeyed no rules. As the water eventually began to recede from the streets of towns like San Antonio, it left behind a landscape of mud-choked wreckage and a bizarre, stinking collection of souvenirs from its violent journey. People wading through the muck to assess the damage to their homes and businesses found themselves navigating a scene that was equal parts tragic and utterly strange. The flood had scoured the riverbed clean and raided the ecosystems along its banks, depositing an array of aquatic life far from its natural home. Slithering catfish and gasping bass were found stranded in urban intersections, their scales caked in drying mud. Turtles, scooped from their logs, now sat motionless in the middle of cobblestone streets. But the most unsettling discoveries were the larger, more primitive creatures that the flood had churned up from the depths. Several residents reported finding alligator gar, ancient toothy fish that can grow longer than a man, left flapping weakly in the gutters and alleyways. These prehistoric-looking monsters, with their razor-sharp teeth and armored scales, were a shocking and frightening sight to encounter miles from the river, adding a layer of primal, surreal horror to the already overwhelming task of cleaning up. The Texas flood of 1921 was more than a tragedy. It was a demonstration of nature's ability to not just destroy, but to completely disorient, turning rivers backward and strewing the remnants of a hidden world across the civilized streets of a modern city. Yet for all the river-reversing fury of the Texas flood, it was a broadly regional event, its dangers spread across a wide landscape. The tragedy that would unfold in Colorado's Big Thompson Canyon just over half a century later was the polar opposite, a disaster of breathtaking speed and terrifyingly narrow focus, where the danger was not just underestimated but completely invisible to those in its path. On the balmy afternoon of July 31, 1976, the canyon was a picture of postcard-perfect Americana. The nation was celebrating its bicentennial, and the scenic route along U.S. Highway 34 was packed with vacationing families. Cars snaked along the winding road beside the river, while hundreds of campers and picnickers had settled into the narrow canyon floor, enjoying the cool water and the towering rocky walls under a seemingly typical summer sky. What they could not see and had no way of knowing was that a meteorological time bomb was ticking directly over their heads. The catalyst was a seemingly innocuous wind pattern. A weak easterly flow was pushing moist air from the plains directly up against the abrupt, vertical wall of the Rocky Mountain foothills. This air had no choice but to rise, and as it did, it collided with a massive, stationary layer of cold air parked over the mountains. The result was not a passing storm, but a freakish, self-perpetuating engine of rain. A single, massive thunderstorm cell formed and then simply stopped moving, locked in place by these competing air masses. For the next 4 hours, this stationary storm acted like a massive faucet, pouring an unimaginable concentration of rain into the small, steep watershed of the Big Thompson River. In some places, the rainfall rate hit an almost incomprehensible 12 inches in just 2 hours, a volume of water that the narrow, rocky canyon was utterly incapable of handling. The first sign of trouble was not water, but sound. Campers later recalled a low, building rumble that they initially mistook for a commercial jet flying low through the canyon or even distant fireworks. But the sound quickly grew into a deafening, earth-shaking roar. Then came the wall of water. It wasn't a gradual rising of the river. It was a single 20-foot-high wave of pure destruction, a churning black soup of water, boulders, shredded trees, and mud that exploded around the canyon's bends. This was not a river flooding. It was the entire canyon violently purging itself in one catastrophic pulse. The force was so immense that it scoured the riverbed down to bedrock, ripping out everything in its way. In the midst of this chaos were moments of bizarre and heartbreaking irony. Just hours before the flood wave hit, a park ranger had driven through the canyon, using his loudspeaker to warn people of the rising water. Many simply waved him off, assuming it was a minor rise or, incredibly, an official celebration for the bicentennial. Others, seeing the clear skies directly above them, found the warning impossible to believe. How could there be a flood when the sun was shining right here? This tragic disconnect between local weather and distant, unseen storm highlights the cruelest trick of the flash flood: its ability to strike from a clear sky, giving its victims no visual cue to trigger their escape. The aftermath was a scene of surreal and gruesome devastation. The canyon highway was simply gone, replaced by a wasteland of mud and house-sized boulders. Cars had been wrapped around trees like tinfoil or buried under 10 feet of gravel. The most haunting discoveries came later as rescue crews searched the debris. They found cars whose occupants had desperately tried to outrun the wave, only to be overtaken and buried. In a final, eerie testament to the flood's raw power, searchers found victims whose clothing had been completely stripped from their bodies by the force of the water and debris. A detail that spoke to the violence of a disaster that arrived without warning and rewrote a landscape in less than an hour. If the tragedy of the 1889 Johnstown flood felt like a singular, historic nightmare, the idea that such a disaster could repeat itself in the exact same place seemed almost unthinkable. The city had rebuilt itself from the mud and rubble, fortified with a new sense of resilience and a modern system of dams and channels designed to prevent such a catastrophe from ever happening again. But on the rainy night of July 19, 1977, a cruel and bizarre twist of fate was unfolding. It had been exactly 88 years, almost to the day, since the South Fork Dam had failed. Now, a different set of dams, stressed beyond their limits by a storm of almost supernatural intensity, were about to give way, plunging Johnstown into a horrifyingly familiar nightmare. The rain began in the afternoon, a typical summer thunderstorm that quickly revealed itself to be anything but typical. A near-stationary system parked itself over the region, dumping an incredible 12 inches of rain in just 24 hours on the already saturated hills surrounding the city. The small, normally placid streams that fed into the Kanemo River became instant torrents, but the real danger was brewing at the aging Laurel Run Dam and the newer, earthen-built Laurel Reservoir Dam. The pressure from the colossal volume of runoff was more than these structures could bear. In a terrifying echo of 1889, the dams breached, unleashing a 30-foot-high wall of water that roared down the same valley path its predecessor had taken nearly 9 decades before. The destruction was immense and violent, but it was also strangely, almost mysteriously, selective. This created one of the most peculiar and haunting aspects of the '77 flood. The immense force of the water, carrying with it a deadly slurry of mud, cars, and shattered trees, did not behave as a uniform wave. It behaved more like a conscious, capricious force, choosing its targets with a logic that defied all understanding. Entire brick buildings were scoured from their foundations and reduced to piles of rubble, while fragile wooden houses immediately next door were left standing, their structures shaken but intact. A massive commercial bakery was completely washed away, leaving no trace but a small, glass-fronted newsstand, and across the street survived with only a broken window. This bizarre and seemingly random patterning of devastation left survivors and investigators alike grappling for answers, with many struggling to see it as anything other than a strange and cruel lottery. In the aftermath, as the community began the heartbreaking task of cleaning up for a second time in a century, the coincidence of the dates became an unavoidable and deeply unsettling point of reflection. For a disaster of such magnitude to strike the same city in the same month with the same root cause, a failed dam created an eerie sense of historical resonance that felt more like a dark curse than simple bad luck. This second calamity seemed to etch a permanent lesson of humility into the soul of Johnstown, a stark reminder that human engineering, for all its advances, is still at the mercy of nature's most extreme and unpredictable moods. The '77 flood, while claiming far fewer lives than the first, became a profound and somber bookend to a story the city never imagined it would have to tell twice. Yet if the flash floods of Colorado and the recurring nightmares of Pennsylvania represented nature's explosive, immediate fury, the disaster that began to unfold across America's heartland in the spring of 1993 would demonstrate a different, more insidious kind of power, one that didn't strike with a sudden wave, but instead settled in with a terrifying, waterlogged permanence. The Great Flood of '93 was not a single event but a slow-motion catastrophe that built over months, a colossal act of saturation where the sky simply seemed to forget how to stop raining. A persistent weather pattern, stuck in a loop like a broken record, funneled a seemingly endless series of storms over the upper Mississippi and Missouri River basins. The ground, already soaked from a wet autumn and a heavy snowmelt, could absorb no more. Every new downpour had nowhere to go but straight into the rivers, which began to swell beyond any historical precedent, transforming the very continent's circulatory system into a bloated, continent-wide threat. This created a surreal and exhausting new reality for the millions of people living in the floodplain. Unlike a hurricane or a tornado, which arrives and departs in a matter of hours, this flood did not leave. It parked itself over the Midwest for nearly 6 months, a relentless siege of water that tested human endurance to its absolute limit. Levees, the very symbols of our control over rivers, became the front lines of a desperate, round-the-clock war. Thousands of volunteers and National Guard troops spent weeks filling and placing sandbags, building these earthen walls higher and higher in a frantic race against the creeping water. The landscape itself became a bizarre inversion. For months, you could stand on a levee and look down onto the roofs of buildings in a town that now existed in a sunken, artificial valley, its survival dependent entirely on the integrity of a wall of sand and clay. It was during this prolonged, high-pressure standoff that one of the flood's strangest and most geologically fascinating phenomena emerged: the sand boil. To understand a sand boil, you have to imagine the immense weight of a river held 20 or 30 feet above the surrounding countryside by a levee. That water is under tremendous pressure, and it relentlessly seeks a path through or under the barrier. When it finds a weak spot in the permeable soil beneath the levee, it forces its way through, creating an underground spring on the dry side. But this isn't clear water. It's a jet of sandy slurry that erupts from the ground like a miniature volcano, bubbling and churning in a constant, ominous boil. From a distance, they looked almost whimsical, like little natural fountains. But to the engineers and volunteers guarding the levees, the appearance of a sand boil was a heart-stopping alarm bell. Each one represented a potentially catastrophic underground erosion event, a silent sabotage that could cause a levee to collapse from below without any visible warning on its surface. The fight against them was a bizarre and frantic battle. Crews would race to a new boil and surround it with a ring of sandbags, creating a containment pond. The idea was to allow the water to continue flowing upward, but to do so into a contained area where the water pressure on both sides of the leak could equalize, preventing further erosion of soil from under the levee. The landscape became dotted with these strange, temporary craters, hissing and gurgling like geothermal vents, each one a tiny but potent reminder of the incredible forces humanity was trying to hold back. While humans fought this desperate holding action on the levees, the animal kingdom responded to the new, vast inland sea with a startling and rapid adaptability. The floodwaters inundated millions of acres of farmland and forest, creating a sprawling, temporary archipelago. The highest points in the landscape, hilltops, stretches of highway built on causeways, even the levees themselves were transformed into isolated islands teeming with displaced life. These became bizarre, crowded arcs of biodiversity. A single wooded hilltop might host a tense, temporary truce between natural enemies. Deer huddled alongside foxes, raccoons perched in trees above resting coyotes, all driven to the same tiny refuge by the shared need for dry land. The air above these islands thrummed with a different kind of life, as millions of mosquitoes hatched in the stagnant waters, creating clouds so dense they became a genuine health hazard for the creatures below. Perhaps the most dramatic and strangely beautiful spectacle was the mass migration of snakes. As the water swallowed their terrestrial habitats, non-venomous water snakes, rat snakes, and garter snakes were forced to seek higher ground. They slithered up trees, coiled on rooftops, and draped themselves over the branches of submerged bushes. In some places, the concentration was so high that trees appeared to be alive, their limbs writhing with knots of serpents waiting for the waters to recede. For the human residents, it was a deeply unsettling sight, a biblical scale plague made real. Yet, it was also a powerful testament to the resilience of life and the rapid, unexpected reorganization of entire ecosystems that such a monumental flood could trigger. The Great Flood of '93 was a lesson in scale and patience, demonstrating that water could be just as destructive through relentless, prolonged pressure as it could through a single, violent wave, and that in its wake it could create a strangely crowded and temporary new world. Yet even as the '93 flood demonstrated nature's slow, grinding power over the heartland, a very different kind of deluge was brewing for the 21st century, one that would strike a cultural nerve in a way few natural disasters ever have, targeting not just a city, but the very heart of American music itself. The stage for the Nashville flood of 2010 was set by a perfect and terrible confluence of events. A series of intense storms, one after another, funneled an almost unimaginable volume of rain into the Cumberland River watershed over the first 2 days of May. This was not a river flood in the traditional sense. It was a total hydrological overload of the entire region. The Cumberland, which cradles downtown Nashville in a wide curve, swelled to monstrous proportions, but the real devastation came from its countless smaller tributaries, which exploded from their banks and poured into the city from every direction. The result was a disaster that felt both biblical and bizarrely modern, as the rising waters engulfed landmarks in ways that seemed to defy both logic and expectation. One of the most surreal and widely shared images to emerge from the chaos was the sight of portable classroom buildings, those ubiquitous boxes found at schools across the country, being swept off their foundations and carried away by the churning currents. But these weren't just floating into fields, they were funneled onto the city's major transportation arteries. Interstate 24, a vital concrete ribbon normally packed with cars and trucks, was transformed into a bizarre, slow-moving river, and its new traffic consisted of these giant, rectangular units bobbing and spinning as they drifted downstream. For drivers stranded on the overpasses, it was a scene of utter disbelief watching the very symbols of education and routine become unmoored and transformed into surreal, destructive barges crashing into overpass supports and pylons. It was a powerful, unsettling metaphor for how the flood had dismantled the ordinary world and set it adrift. But the true cultural heartbreak was happening elsewhere, in the places where music lives. The rising waters surged into the basement of the Schermerhorn Symphony Center, a bastion of classical refinement, destroying priceless instruments and silencing its concert hall. Yet it was the flooding of the Grand Ole Opry House that sent a shockwave through the nation. The hallowed home of country music, a stage that had hosted legends from Hank Williams to Johnny Cash, was inundated with several feet of murky, foul-smelling water. The site of the iconic circle of dark wood from the original Ryman Auditorium stage, the most sacred ground in country music submerged and silent, was a devastating blow. The floodwaters did not discriminate, washing over the pews and soaking the dressing rooms where so much history had been made. And in these silent, waterlogged spaces, something acoustically strange began to occur. As the flood invaded music venues like the basement of the Ryman itself and smaller clubs along the river, it altered the very physics of sound within them. The water, acting as a massive, dampening barrier, deadened the usual echoes and reverberations, creating an eerie, suffocating silence. But in other spaces, partially flooded rooms with air pockets, the sound of the water itself lapping against walls, dripping from ceilings, gurgling through vents, was amplified and distorted. Acousticians later described it as a unique and haunting phenomenon. These temples of sound, designed to project every note to the back row, were now conducting a dissonant, aqueous symphony of their own destruction, a creepy, natural requiem for the stages that had fallen silent. While the sheer power of the rapid city flood was terrifying, the events leading up to it were marked by a series of strange atmospheric quirks that made the disaster feel almost supernatural. The stationary thunderstorm that parked itself over the Black Hills wasn't just a random weather event. It was a meteorological anomaly of the highest order. Typically, storms are carried along by high-altitude winds, but on that night, these steering currents simply vanished. The massive storm cell became a self-sustaining island in the sky, drawing in a continuous supply of warm, moist air from the south while its cold core anchored it firmly in place. This created a terrifyingly efficient rain-making machine that dumped more water in a few hours than the region usually sees in half a year, all concentrated on one small, devastatingly vulnerable area. In the hours before the first creeks began to swell, some residents reported even more bizarre signs than just the relentless rain. There were scattered accounts of small animals, particularly frogs, falling from the sky amidst the torrential downpour. This phenomenon, known as animal rain, is a rare but documented meteorological event where small, lightweight creatures are swept up by powerful updrafts in a storm, carried aloft, and then dropped back to Earth when the storm's intensity changes. For those who witnessed it, it was a deeply unsettling premonition, a sign that nature was operating under rules far stranger and more violent than anyone could have anticipated. The skies weren't just offering water, they were offering life itself, and then they were about to take it away in a deluge. Once the flood wave began its deadly rush through the city, it displayed a capricious and almost intelligent sense of destruction, following pathways that defied human logic. In some neighborhoods, the water behaved with a bizarre precision, funneling itself with terrifying efficiency down the exact paths of the paved streets. Witnesses described seeing the floodwaters rage down the center of main thoroughfares like Omaha Street, acting like a river that had suddenly decided to obey traffic laws, while the sidewalks and yards on either side remained relatively untouched. This created surreal scenes where people could stand on their porches, just feet from the churning torrent, watching the devastation flow past their property lines like a horrific parade. Yet, just blocks away, the water demonstrated its utter contempt for human planning. In other areas, particularly where the natural landscape had been significantly altered by development, the flood ignored the man-made grid completely. It plowed straight through houses, shopping centers, and parks, carving its own brutal and direct new channels to the lowest point. This resulted in the complete and total obliteration of some structures while leaving adjacent buildings seemingly untouched, a random and cruel lottery that survivors struggled to comprehend. One house might be scooped clean from its foundation, while its next-door neighbor suffered only minor basement flooding. This inconsistent and unpredictable path of destruction added a layer of psychological torment to the physical damage, leaving a community to grapple not just with loss, but with the haunting question of why some were spared and others were not. The stories of survival that emerged from the wreckage of the Austin flood read less like historical accounts and more like chapters from a surreal adventure novel, each one testing the boundaries of believability. While many were tragically overcome by the sheer force of the Molasses' thick wave of water and debris, others found themselves participants in a bizarre and terrifying journey, their lives saved by a combination of sheer luck, quick thinking, and the most unexpected of floating devices. Consider the experience of the Doherty family, whose entire home was lifted from its foundation and carried nearly 2 miles down the ravaged valley. As the house began to break apart around them, they were forced onto the roof, clutching the shuddering shingles as their improvised raft spun in the current. For what felt like an eternity, they rode the crest of the destruction, watching the world blur past in a nightmare of swirling water and shattered lumber until their house finally collided with a stand of sturdy trees, lodging there just long enough for them to scramble to safety. In another part of town, a group of mill workers found themselves trapped on the upper floor of a collapsing building as the water rose around them. With no obvious means of escape, their salvation came from an utterly unexpected source, a grand piano that had been washed out of a nearby home. The massive instrument, its wood swollen and its strings humming a dissonant tune with the motion of the water, bobbed past their window like a lifeboat sent by some musical deity. One by one, they leaped from the building into the churning water and hauled themselves atop the floating piano, clinging to its carved legs and edges as it carried them away from the most violent flow and into slower, shallower water where they could finally wade to relative safety. That a symbol of cultured parlor entertainment could become a rugged, buoyant lifeline in the midst of such raw destruction is one of the flood's most strangely beautiful ironies. Perhaps the most resourceful tale of survival involved a young farmer named Elias Kemp. Caught in the open as the wave approached, Kemp's initial instinct was to run for the high ground, but he quickly realized the water was moving too fast. His eyes fell on his own hay field, and in a moment of brilliant clarity, he began frantically cutting the ropes that bound several large hay bales together. As the water reached his waist, he pushed and pulled the bales, maneuvering them into a rough circle. He then climbed atop this hastily assembled raft, using his pocket knife to cut strands of hay to braid into a makeshift rope, which he used to lash himself to his floating island. For hours, he drifted on this fragrant, prickly life preserver, the absorbent hay keeping him surprisingly buoyant even as it became waterlogged. He was eventually rescued miles downstream, cold and scratched but alive, thanks to his quick thinking and the humble hay bale, a testament to how ordinary objects, in the hands of someone with presence of mind, can become extraordinary tools of survival. These miraculous stories, set against the backdrop of overwhelming loss, highlight a profound truth of disaster. In the chaos, the line between tragedy and miracle is often drawn by the most peculiar and unpredictable of circumstances. Yet as the modern floods of Nashville and Rapid City demonstrated the relentless power of water, history reminds us that the most astonishing deluges are often those that time itself has almost forgotten. To find the true benchmark for catastrophic flooding in the American West, we must travel back in time to the winter of 1861, when the skies over California simply opened up and decided not to close for a month and a half. What began as a welcome respite from a years-long drought quickly morphed into an unending nightmare. From late December through January of 1862, a seemingly permanent series of atmospheric rivers, vast conveyor belts of tropical moisture, parked themselves over the state. For 43 consecutive days and nights, the rain fell with a punishing consistency, turning the entire Central Valley into a shallow, churning ocean. This was not merely a river overflowing its banks. It was the wholesale transformation of an entire region into an inland sea 300 miles long and in some places 20 miles wide, a temporary Pacific Ocean annex that utterly erased the landscape as anyone knew it. The sheer scale of this new waterways created scenes of such profound surreality that they challenged the very definition of reality for those who witnessed them. Where countless farms, ranches, and budding towns had once stood, there was now only a vast, wind-whipped expanse of brown water. Into this strange new world sailed the familiar silhouettes of steamships, but their context was utterly bizarre. These vessels, designed to ply the deep water harbors of San Francisco and the Sacramento River, were now chugging confidently across what had recently been wheat fields and cattle pastures, their smokestacks billowing against a backdrop of submerged oak trees and the rooftops of drowned farmhouses. Passengers on deck could peer over the rails and see the faint, ghostly outlines of fence lines and irrigation ditches shimmering beneath the surface, a sunken civilization guiding their voyage. The steamships became the only reliable link between isolated communities, delivering supplies to second-story windows and rescuing families from the upper floors of hotels that had become de facto islands in a continental sea. It was a jarring collision of the modern and the primordial, a glimpse of a world reverted to its ancient, flooded state, with technology providing the only frail tether to the world that was. This immense inland sea also triggered one of the most desperate and peculiar mass migrations in American history. As the water swallowed the lowlands, every creature, human and animal alike, was forced to seek the same few patches of high ground. Hilltops that had once stood as lonely landmarks in a sea of grass became crowded, chaotic arcs of survival. Cattle, horses, sheep, and wildlife like deer and grizzly bears were driven together onto these tiny islands, creating scenes of tense and unprecedented truce. Predator and prey stood side by side, too exhausted and terrified by the rising water to engage in their natural conflicts. The sounds were a cacophony of panicked mooing, bleating, and whinnying, all underscored by the constant, terrifying lap of water against the shrinking banks. But the most bizarre travelers were those that took to the water itself. As their burrows flooded, entire colonies of ground squirrels, gophers, and rats were seen desperately swimming in vast, struggling fleets, their noses pointed toward any distant speck of dry land. Snakes, driven from their habitats, coiled themselves into living rafts, tangling together in floating knots to stay above the waterline. This strange exodus reached its peak when the floodwaters began to recede, revealing a landscape carpeted in a thick, glistening layer of mud. As the goo dried and cracked under the returning sun, it unveiled one final, macabre surprise: the perfectly preserved tracks of countless animals, etched into the hardened mud like a fossilized record of their frantic final journeys. For the settlers who survived, the Great Flood of 1862 was more than a disaster. It was a humbling lesson in the raw, indifferent power of nature, an event so vast and strange that it would shape California's water laws and fears for generations to come. While the Great Flood of 1862 had submerged California under a temporary ocean, a different kind of aquatic menace was building in the northeastern United States 7 decades later, one born not of endless rain but of a deep and punishing winter. The New England flood of 1936 was a disaster delivered in two brutal acts. First, an unusually harsh season buried the region under massive snowpack and locked its rivers in thick ice. Then, in March, a sudden and dramatic thaw, coupled with heavy rain, unleashed a catastrophic double punch. A massive volume of meltwater that the frozen ground could not absorb, and a raging, destructive army of ice. This wasn't just water rising, it was the entire winter's accumulated fury being released in a matter of days, and it would test the resilience of the region in profoundly strange ways. The first signs of the coming catastrophe were not the sounds of rushing water, but something far more sinister and alien, a low, grinding, shrieking roar that echoed through the river valleys. This was the sound of the ice tsunamis, as the water level beneath the ice began to rise rapidly from the melt and rain. The massive, solid sheets of ice that covered the rivers like plaster casts were shattered and lifted. But they didn't simply break apart and float away. Instead, the immense, jagged plates were shoved upward and forward by the tremendous hydraulic pressure, piling atop one another in a chaotic, slow-motion avalanche. These towering walls of ice, some reaching heights of 30 feet or more, began to crawl inexorably downstream, bulldozing everything in their path. They scraped riverbanks clean of trees and buildings, and when they met a bridge, the result was inevitable and terrifying. The ice would pile against the upstream side, creating a colossal, grinding dam that multiplied the water pressure exponentially until the bridge's foundations were simply scoured away or the structure was pushed over sideways into the torrent. One after another, century-old bridges that had survived countless floods were effortlessly demolished by this frozen battering ram, severing the vital links between towns and cities. The destruction of this infrastructure created an immediate and bizarre new reality: total isolation. Entire communities were suddenly marooned, transformed into islands cut off from the outside world. With roads washed out and rail lines submerged, standard supply chains vanished overnight. This forced a wave of peculiar and ingenious adaptations. In many towns, the local drugstore or general merchant suddenly became the central command post, not for selling goods but for rationing them. Store owners, often the only ones with large stocks of canned food, candles, and medical supplies, would work with town leaders to create impromptu distribution networks, sometimes accepting handwritten IOUs in place of cash. The most critical shortage, however, was often fresh milk for children. This led to one of the flood's most surreal sights: dairy farmers from inaccessible rural areas, unable to get their product to their usual processing plants, would instead load 10-gallon cans of milk onto rowboats and attempt to navigate the flooded, ice-choked valleys. They'd row for miles, delivering cans directly to the porches of submerged houses or to collection points set up on second-floor balconies, their oars pushing aside chunks of ice as they went. Perhaps the most remarkable adaptation was the sudden, vital resurgence of a seemingly obsolete technology: the amateur radio operator. With telephone poles down and lines dead, these hobbyists, often working from attics and makeshift power supplies, became the only lifeline for countless stranded communities. Their crackling Morse code signals cut through the static, carrying out desperate pleas for help and coordinating the delivery of supplies. A request for insulin from a cut-off town in Vermont would be received by an operator in Massachusetts, who would then relay it to the National Guard, setting in motion a complex rescue operation involving boats and even aircraft. These radio hams, operating in a frantic, continuous shift system, created a weird, invisible network of communication that floated over the drowned landscape, a temporary nervous system for a region that had been physically shattered. The 1936 flood demonstrated that while nature could wield ice like a weapon to destroy the modern world, human ingenuity, community spirit, and a few determined people with rowboats and radio sets could mount a powerful, if peculiar, defense. While the previous floods demonstrated nature's power to reshape landscapes and rewrite the rules of rivers, the catastrophe that struck the American heartland in the summer of 1951 delivered a uniquely potent blend of devastation and surreal spectacle, hitting the economic and cultural core of a major city in a way that was both horrifying and oddly comical. The Great Flood of 1951 was a basin-wide disaster for the Kansas River system, the result of relentless, record-breaking rains that fell across Kansas and Missouri that July. The land, already saturated from a wet spring, could hold no more water, and every creek and tributary swelled into a raging torrent, all feeding into the mighty Kaw as it made its way toward Kansas City. The city, built at the confluence of the Kansas and Missouri rivers, was a sitting duck. Despite a frantic, sandbagging effort of heroic proportions, the levees were simply overwhelmed. The water didn't just spill over the top, it blasted through in places, pouring into the industrial and commercial districts with the force of a fire hose. The floodwaters sought out the city's lowest-lying areas with a cruel precision, and none were more vulnerable than the massive stockyards and packing plants in the West Bottoms district. This was the very heart of Kansas City's identity, a sprawling, gritty complex where thousands of cattle, hogs, and sheep were held daily, a place that normally echoed with the cacophony of animal lowing and the relentless hum of industry. As the water surged in, it transformed this organized chaos into a scene of pure pandemonium. Holding pens became death traps as the water rose with terrifying speed. Panicked animals, driven by primal instinct, began to smash through wooden fences and gates in a desperate bid for survival. Soon, the streets of the industrial district were not just flooded, they were host to a bizarre, swimming stampede. Herds of bewildered cattle, their eyes wide with terror, found themselves paddling awkwardly down what had once been busy avenues, their horns and noses just breaking the surface of the muddy water. Hogs and sheep, less suited to swimming, formed struggling, bleating flotillas pushed along by the current. The air was thick with a symphony of distress calls, frightened moos, panicked squeals, and frantic bleating, all mixing with the sound of rushing water to create a soundscape of utter bedlam. This presented a crisis unlike any the city had ever faced. The economic loss was staggering, but the immediate problem was one of public safety and bizarre logistics. Loose 1,500-pound steers are dangerous under the best of circumstances. 1,000 of them, panicked and swimming through a flooded urban landscape, were a public menace. They could crash into buildings, overturn rescue boats, or simply drown and create a massive health hazard. The standard emergency response playbook had no chapter on urban cattle roundup during a flood, so city officials did the only thing that made sense: they put out a call for cowboys. From the surrounding ranches in Kansas and Missouri, ranch hands and rodeo riders answered the call, arriving on the scene with their lassos and their horseback skills, only to find that horses were useless in the deep, debris-filled water. Without missing a beat, they adapted, trading their saddles for the seats of flat-bottomed john boats and skiffs commandeered from local marinas. And so began one of the most surreal rescue and recovery operations in American history. The gritty urban canyons of the West Bottoms, normally filled with the smell of manure and industry, were now a hunter-green lake, and the new age cowboys navigated it with a determined focus. They'd paddle quietly up to a swimming steer, expertly toss a lasso around its neck or horns, and then secure the rope to their boat. The sight of a small aluminum boat puttering along, towing a massive, swimming bovine behind it like a water skier, became a common and utterly bizarre image. Some of the more agile cowboys would even leap from their boats onto the backs of calmer animals, riding them like bizarre, hairy sea monsters to guide them toward areas of shallower water or makeshift corrals set up on sections of higher ground, like railroad embankments that now functioned as islands. It was a scene straight out of a Hollywood Western, but drenched in floodwater and playing out against a backdrop of half-submerged factories and warehouses. This strange fusion of Old West skills and modern disaster response was not only effective but became a powerful symbol of Midwestern resourcefulness, a willingness to meet a bizarre and unprecedented challenge with whatever tools and talents were at hand. But if the floods of the past had often been framed as acts of God or unavoidable natural disasters, the tragedy that unfolded in the narrow hollows of Buffalo Creek, West Virginia, on a cold February morning in 1972 would fundamentally shatter that notion, revealing a catastrophe born not of nature but of human negligence and leaving behind a flood of strange, choking black and a legal battle that would redefine corporate responsibility. For the residents of the 16 small coal mining communities tucked along the creek, the looming presence of the Pittston Coal Company's massive slag dam was simply a part of the landscape, a huge earthen wall holding back a vast black lake of liquid coal waste known as slurry. For years, there had been whispers and concerns about the dam's stability, but these were largely dismissed. Then, after several days of heavy rain, the unthinkable happened. At approximately 8 o'clock on the morning of February 26th, the dam's middle section liquefied and collapsed, unleashing an estimated 132 million gallons of thick, viscous, jet-black slurry. This was not a flood of water, it was something far more sinister and surreal. The wave that roared down the 18-mile-long valley was a churning, 15 to 20-foot high wall of liquefied coal waste, a substance with the consistency of wet concrete and the destructive force of a freight train. It moved with a deafening roar, but its most terrifying feature was its color. Survivors described it as a wave of black water or black death, an impenetrable Inkai darkness that blotted out the world as it advanced, swallowing homes, cars, and entire communities in a thick, suffocating embrace. The sheer weight and density of the slurry meant it didn't just knock structures over. It pulverized them into splinters and then buried the wreckage under a deep, hardening crust of black muck. The force was so immense that it swept large coal trucks down the valley, as if they were toys, and wrapped heavy railroad tracks around trees like licorice sticks. In the aftermath, the scene was one of almost apocalyptic strangeness. The vibrant, familiar mountain hollow had been transformed into a monochromatic nightmarescape. Every surface, trees, rocks, the few remaining buildings, was coated in a thick, drying layer of cracking black sludge. The air itself was filled with a fine, black dust, making it difficult to breathe and coating the faces of survivors and rescuers in a ghastly, funereal mask. The most haunting and bizarre discoveries were made as rescue crews began the grim task of searching the debris. They found victims who had been completely encased in the drying slurry, their bodies preserved in a terrible black shell. Others were found with their clothing torn completely off by the force of the thick sludge, a detail that spoke to its terrifying power. 125 people lost their lives in the initial onslaught, and over 1,000 were left injured and homeless, their communities simply erased from the map. But the peculiar legacy of the Buffalo Creek disaster was not written solely in the black sludge it left behind. It was forged in the courtrooms that followed. In the wake of the tragedy, the Pittston Coal Company did what large corporations often did at the time. It claimed the dam failure was an act of God, an unavoidable natural disaster caused by the extraordinary rainfall. This is where the story took a groundbreaking turn. A team of lawyers representing over 600 survivors took on the company's argument not just on the grounds of physical negligence in the dam's construction, but on a revolutionary psychological premise. They argued that the trauma experienced by the survivors constituted a legitimate and actionable injury in itself, something they termed the Buffalo Creek Syndrome. This legal strategy was unprecedented. The lawyers brought in psychiatrists to interview the survivors, documenting a widespread condition of profound apathy, anxiety, and emotional distress. People who had once been vibrant members of a close-knit community were now described as withdrawn, listless, and emotionally numb, suffering from what we would now clearly recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. The legal case successfully argued that the company's negligence had not only destroyed their homes and killed their loved ones, but had also shattered their very sense of community and psychological well-being. The resulting settlement was a landmark victory, establishing a critical new legal precedent that emotional distress and collective trauma could be considered direct damages in a disaster case, paving the way for how victims of future industrial accidents and tragedies would seek compensation. The black water of Buffalo Creek left a physical stain that would take years to clean, but its legal and psychological legacy would permanently change the American justice system's understanding of corporate accountability and the deep, lasting wounds of trauma. Just as the black sludge of Buffalo Creek redefined the very meaning of a flood, another deluge would soon demonstrate how rising water could play tricks on the mind, turning a familiar cityscape into a theater of eerie illusions. In the autumn of 1998, a series of relentless storms besieged central Texas, culminating in a torrential downpour over San Antonio on the night of October 17th. The city's intricate network of creeks and the San Antonio River itself, normally a gentle, tourist-friendly waterway snaking past the Alamo and the River Walk, transformed into a raging torrent in a matter of hours. But as the water crept into neighborhoods and surged over highways, it didn't just bring destruction. It brought a phenomenon so strange and unsettling that locals would later struggle to describe it, coining the term flood ghosts for the spectral visions that appeared in the murky, rising darkness. These flood ghosts were not paranormal apparitions, but rather terrifyingly convincing optical illusions born from the specific conditions of an urban flood. As water poured into the city's low-lying streets, it often rose with a strange and deceptive stillness, creating a vast, flat, and perfectly reflective surface that mirrored the dark, stormy sky above. In the poor visibility of the torrential rain and deep night, this created a powerful mirage. A street that was actually submerged under 6 feet of water could appear to be a shallow, shimmering puddle, its surface reflecting the sky in a way that perfectly mimicked the appearance of wet asphalt. Drivers, confused by the illusion and unable to see the curb or road markings, would then plunge their vehicles into the deceptively deep abyss, believing they were navigating a mere inch of water. Other ghostly phenomena included the eerie appearance of floating stoplights and street signs. As water rose to submerge the poles supporting them, the signs themselves would often remain visible just above the surface. With their supports invisible beneath the murky water, the signs appeared to hover mysteriously and independently in mid-air, detached from the physical world like phantom road markers guiding travelers through a sunken city. The most disorienting effect was the complete dissolution of the visual horizon. The seamless blend of sky and water on the surface erased all perspective, making it impossible to judge depth or distance. A tree submerged to its branches might look like a small bush. A ditch could appear to be a canyon. This sensory deception turned the flooded city into a dangerous labyrinth where nothing was as it seemed, and a single wrong step based on a visual trick could have fatal consequences. When the sun rose the next morning, revealing the staggering extent of the inundation, the bizarre spectacle continued. The floodwaters, now receding from their peak, had scoured the city and its surrounding tributaries, gathering a bizarre collection of objects and setting them adrift in a slow, chaotic parade. The River Walk, designed for romantic boat rides and bustling cafes, was instead hosting a flotilla of the utterly absurd. Floating solemnly past restaurants were entire picnic tables, their umbrellas still open like bizarre, drifting flowers. A fleet of propane tanks from backyard grills bobbed along like metallic buoys, while children's inflatable bounce houses, torn from their moorings in suburban yards, drifted by with a sad, deflated grandeur. The strangest sights, however, were found along the major commercial avenues that had turned into temporary rivers. The current carried a surreal inventory of San Antonio's daily life. Dozens of industrial-sized plastic drums, their original contents unknown, rolled and bumped along in the current, but the most talked float items were the countless thousands of pumpkins. The flood had struck in the heart of October, and it targeted the numerous pumpkin patches and Halloween superstores on the city's outskirts. The rising water lifted this vast orange harvest from its fields and parking lot displays, sending them on a journey downtown. For days afterward, the city's landscape was dotted with these bright, round fruits, piled against bridge pylons, stranded on medians, and gathered in quiet eddies. The sight of these symbols of autumn festivity scattered amidst the mud and wreckage created a jarring, almost funhouse mirror image of the season, a cheerful symbol of harvest now serving as a marker of devastating loss, a strange and colorful testament to the flood's peculiar and far-reaching appetite. This meteorological monster was born from a seemingly minor wind quirk that escalated into a catastrophic feedback loop. A weak easterly breeze, often harmless, became the unwitting architect of disaster by pushing a continuous supply of warm, moisture-laden air from the plains directly toward the steep, vertical wall of the Rocky Mountain foothills. This moist air had no choice but to rise, and as it did, it slammed into a massive, immovable layer of cold air parked stubbornly over the higher elevations. The collision didn't create a typical moving storm. It forged a freakish, self-sustaining atmospheric engine. A single, enormous thunderstorm cell formed directly over the canyon's headwaters and then simply stopped. It became anchored, locked in place by the competing air masses, transforming the sky into a stationary production plant for rain. For 4 relentless hours, this system acted less like a storm and more like a massive fire hose pointed directly at the ground, pouring an almost inconceivable concentration of water into the small, steep, and rocky watershed of the Big Thompson River. In the hardest-hit areas, rainfall rates reached a staggering 12 inches in just 2 hours, a volume of water that the narrow, confined canyon was structurally incapable of absorbing or channeling away. The cruelest trick this meteorological setup played was its localized nature, which actively prevented effective warnings. The storm cell was so tightly focused and stationary that it created a devastating disconnect between those in the canyon and those who might have saved them. While the upper canyon was being pummeled by this biblical downpour, the skies just a few miles downstream in places like Loveland and Estes Park often appeared merely cloudy or were even experiencing light, scattered showers. Residents and vacationers in the canyon itself could look directly overhead and see patches of clear, starry sky between the violent bursts of rain, making the idea of a life-threatening flood feel utterly implausible. This visual contradiction fatally undermined the urgency of the few warnings that did trickle in. When a park ranger drove through the canyon that evening using his vehicle's loudspeaker to urge people to seek higher ground, many simply waved him off. Some thought it was a joke, others, caught up in the bicentennial celebrations, even misinterpreted it as an official announcement for a holiday fireworks display. The very concept of a flash flood, a threat that can strike from a blue sky miles away, was beyond the frame of reference for most people, leaving them tragically vulnerable to a danger they could not see and therefore could not believe. To truly grasp the magnitude of the Johnstown disaster, we must look closer at the dam itself, a structure that was fundamentally flawed from its very rebirth. After falling into disrepair, the South Fork Dam was purchased and hastily rebuilt by a wealthy Pittsburgh fishing and hunting club, a group of industrial titans more concerned with creating a pristine recreational lake than with public safety downstream. Their modifications to the design weren't just careless, they were a masterclass in catastrophic engineering hubris. In a stunningly short-sighted move, the club's work crews lowered the dam's crest by several feet to widen the carriage road across the top, significantly reducing its margin of safety against overtopping. Even more critically, they removed the original discharge pipes, the dam's primary safety valves. These heavy cast iron pipes had been sold for scrap, leaving the massive earthwork with no controlled way to lower the water level in an emergency. The lake was now a locked vault, with its only outlet being an ungated, shallow spillway that was quickly becoming choked with debris. In the days leading up to the collapse, nature sent a series of unmistakable and increasingly frantic warnings that were tragically dismissed. The relentless rain had pushed Lake Cunnamoor to its absolute limit, lapping mere inches from the top of the compromised dam. Club members and employees, in a state of panicked futility, tried desperately to prevent the inevitable. They attempted to dig makeshift secondary spillways to relieve pressure, but their efforts were like trying to empty a bathtub with a teaspoon during a hurricane. Men and horses struggled through the driving rain, up to their knees in mud, piling dirt and whatever else they could find onto the crest in a pathetic attempt to raise it. Witnesses reported seeing the dam itself creeping and moving like a wave as the saturated earth began to shift under the immense hydraulic strain. Down in Johnstown, telegraph lines had gone dead, cut off by the storm, but a final, heroic warning was sent through an alternative line from the town of South Fork. The message, stating simply that the dam was about to break, reached a telegraph operator in Johnstown, but by then, the wall of water was already on its way. The message was never disseminated. The roar of the approaching deluge was the only warning most people would receive. The dam's final failure was not a simple breach but a sudden, total liquidation. The center section simply dissolved, unleashing the entire lake in one single, monstrous pulse, a lesson written in water and mud about the deadly cost of privileging private luxury over public responsibility. But perhaps the most profound and peculiar legacy of the 1927 flood was the strange and temporary economy that sprang up among the refugees. With traditional supply chains severed and cash often useless, these isolated communities on the high ground were forced to invent new systems of value and exchange almost overnight. A vibrant barter economy emerged where a can of fuel might be traded for a loaf of bread, and a precious bottle of medicine could be worth a family's entire stash of salvaged furniture. Ingenious entrepreneurs set up floating stores on rowboats, paddling from levee to levee with salvaged goods, their prices fluctuating wildly based on scarcity and desperation. A single dry cigarette could fetch a day's labor, and fresh drinking water, painstakingly collected from the rain, became more valuable than silver. Music became a crucial, unexpected currency for morale. Men with guitars or harmonicas would play on the levee at night, and families would pay them with their last scraps of food or precious dry blankets for an hour's escape from their reality. Preachers held services on the crowded, muddy slopes, and donations were made not in coins, but in promises of future labor or shared rations. This bizarre micro-society, with its own rules, its own economy, and its own heartbreaking acts of generosity and survival, existed for months, a testament to the human ability to create order and community even in the most chaotic and surreal circumstances. It was a world turned upside down where the high ground was worth more than gold, a song was worth a meal, and the simple act of sharing a dry patch of mud with a stranger could form a bond that would last a lifetime. While the 1938 flood left a city in shock and draped in ocean fish, its most profound legacy was not the immediate cleanup, but the radical and permanent surgical procedure it forced upon the Los Angeles River itself. Before the deluge, the river was largely seen as a benign, mostly dry arroyo, a convenient, empty space that invited development, dumping, and even film shoots. The catastrophic failure of this perception, with water demonstrating its absolute sovereignty over the landscape, demanded a solution of equally absolute finality. The city's response was one of the most ambitious and drastic feats of hydraulic engineering ever attempted: the complete and total encasement of the river in concrete. This was not mere bank reinforcement. It was the creation of a massive, artificial waterslide designed to shoot stormwater out to the ocean as fast as physically possible, fundamentally severing the river's ancient connection to the land and creating a bizarre, post-natural ecosystem in its place. The transformation was staggering in its scale and ambition. Over the following decades, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers embarked on a monumental public works project, pouring millions of tons of concrete to line the river's meandering 51-mile path. The goal was singular: eliminate the flood threat by removing the river's ability to meander, erode, or interact with its floodplain. The gentle, sandy-bottomed wash was replaced by a stark, geometric, and unforgiving channel. This colossal concrete ditch, wide enough to easily contain multiple freeway lanes, fundamentally altered not just the hydrology, but the very soul of the river. It became a utility, a flood control megastructure that happened to occasionally carry water, its banks now sheer, vertical walls designed for efficiency, not for life. Yet, in a twist of ecological irony, life stubbornly insisted on returning to this concrete desert. The new river channel, for all its artificiality, became an accidental haven and a strangely effective wildlife corridor. Despite the harsh environment, seasonal rains still pooled in low spots, creating temporary oases that attracted migratory birds. Hardy plants like willow trees and lush stands of arundo reed found footholds in cracks in the concrete and in the sandy sediment that accumulated at the channel's edges. This tenacious greenery, softening the harsh gray lines, created a surreal, hybrid landscape, part industrial wasteland, part resilient urban wetland. Coyotes, raccoons, and even the occasional deer were spotted navigating its length, using the channel as a secret highway through the dense urban grid, a hidden vein of the wild running through the city's heart. This bizarre new ecosystem sparked a profound cultural and environmental reconsideration of what the river could be. For generations, Angelenos had been taught to see the concrete channel as a sign of progress and safety, a necessary taming of a dangerous force. But by the end of the 20th century, a new perspective began to emerge. Activists, artists, and community groups started to see the concrete not as a solution, but as a 70-mile-long monument to a flawed philosophy, one that sacrificed natural beauty and community access for sheer utility. The river, once the city's reason for being, had become its forgotten back alley, a place often associated with crime and isolation, hidden behind industrial fencing and neglected under freeway overpasses. This growing movement fought to reframe the Los Angeles River not as a problem to be controlled, but as a lost treasure to be rediscovered and restored. Their efforts culminated in groundbreaking victories, most notably the official designation of the river as a navigable waterway under the Clean Water Act, a legal status that unlocked federal funding for revitalization projects. Today, this has led to ambitious plans to renaturalize entire sections of the channel, tearing up acres of concrete to create new parks, bike paths, and restored habitats. The bizarre concrete scar that was the river's past is now slowly being rewoven into the fabric of the city's future, a testament to the idea that even the most drastic human interventions can be reconsidered, and that a river, no matter how thoroughly engineered, never truly loses its power to capture the imagination and shape the city that surrounds it. Investigating the Great Molasses Flood presented a uniquely bizarre challenge for scientists and engineers, a puzzle where the evidence was not just wreckage, but a thick, sticky residue coating an entire neighborhood. The central question was deceptively simple: how could a substance as seemingly slow and viscous as molasses move with such explosive, destructive force? The answer lay in a fascinating and terrifying property of physics, one that the disaster helped to illustrate on a grand, tragic scale. At the core of the investigation was the concept of viscosity and how it changes with temperature. The molasses stored in the tank was a thick, slow-moving liquid, but it had been kept relatively warm to make it easier to pump and transport. On that unseasonably warm January day, with temperatures climbing into the 40s, the molasses had become significantly less viscous. When the tank failed, this warmed mass did not simply ooze out. It underwent a rapid physical transformation. As the millions of gallons were suddenly released from their immense pressure, they essentially flashed into a state of temporary fluidity, behaving more like a raging flash flood than a slow-moving syrup. The initial wave possessed the density and weight of a heavy liquid, but the kinetic energy of its sudden release gave it the speed and destructive power of a solid object. However, this state was fleeting. As the wave spread through the cold Boston streets, its outer layers began to cool rapidly in the winter air. The viscosity increased dramatically, turning the liquid back into a thick, trapping goo almost as fast as it had arrived. This rapid change in physical state is what made the flood so uniquely deadly. Victims who were not immediately knocked down and drowned by the initial wave's force found themselves hopelessly ensnared, as if caught in a tidal wave of rapidly setting cement. The molasses hardened around them, making rescue agonizingly slow and difficult, and ultimately leading to many of the deaths by suffocation. This scientific analysis became the foundation for one of the most peculiar and groundbreaking legal battles in American history. The victims' families, represented by a dogged attorney named Damon Hall, sued the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, the owner of the tank. The company's defense was a masterclass in deflection, arguing that the disaster was not due to their negligence but an unforeseeable act of God. Specifically, they claimed anarchists had planted a bomb that weakened the tank. This forced the investigation into even stranger territory, with experts hired by both sides conducting elaborate experiments on the properties of molasses and the tensile strength of steel. The court appointed a special auditor, Hugh W. Ogden, to preside over what became a 3-year-long hearing, an exhaustive inquest that heard from more than 1,000 witnesses, from structural engineers to metallurgists to humble neighborhood residents. The resulting legal decision was a monumental shift in corporate accountability. After hearing all the evidence, Auditor Ogden issued a finding that completely rejected the act of God defense. He concluded that the tank was negligently constructed and poorly maintained, noting that it had been leaking since the day it was built and that the company had ignored ominous groaning sounds reported by employees in the days leading to the rupture. Most importantly, the court established that the company, as the owner of an immense container of a dangerous substance in a dense urban area, had an absolute duty to ensure its safety. This principle of strict liability for ultra-hazardous activities set a powerful new precedent, influencing tort law for decades to come and sending a clear message to industry that economic convenience could never outweigh public safety. The Great Molasses Flood, for all its surreal horror, left a legacy far stickier than the residue it deposited on Boston streets. It cemented into law a new standard of responsibility, ensuring that the strange science of that day would never be used as an excuse for human negligence again. The devastation left by the Black Hills flood was absolute, a landscape scoured down to its very bones. But from that profound loss, the people of Rapid City embarked on a journey of remembrance and rebuilding so profound that it fundamentally rewrote the city's relationship with the water that had nearly destroyed it. The most immediate and lasting change was the revolutionary decision not to simply rebuild on the same ground. In a move that was almost unheard of at the time, the city, state, and federal government embarked on a massive land buyout program, purchasing over 1,300 flood-damaged properties in the most vulnerable areas. Instead of new construction, this land was permanently dedicated as a greenway, a sprawling network of parks and open spaces that would act as a natural sponge for future floods. This created a beautiful and bizarre new reality, a vibrant city center now gracefully woven around a vast, meandering park where homes and businesses once stood, a permanent memorial in the form of empty, usable space. This pragmatic response gave birth to some of the flood's most poignant and peculiar memorials, crafted not from marble or bronze, but from the disaster's own wreckage. In a quiet corner of Memorial Park, one of the largest of these new green spaces, sits a haunting sculpture known as the Whirlpool or Journey Monument. It is not a traditional statue, but a massive, twisted knot of steel reinforcing bar, concrete, and plumbing pipes, all pulled from the ruins of a downtown building. This grim artifact, left exactly as the floodwaters mangled it, stands as a stark, abstract testament to the violence of that night, a frozen moment of destruction that challenges viewers to comprehend the forces involved. Even more moving are the simple, subtle markers embedded throughout the city. On the sides of buildings, small plaques with a single bold black line and the words "Flood Level June 9, 1972" are mounted far above one's head, a chilling visual reminder of just how deep the water reached in places where people now casually walk, shop, and dine. The community's need to process the trauma also forged unique and enduring rituals of remembrance. Every year on the anniversary, a solemn ceremony is held at the Prairie Green Cemetery, where a mass grave holds the unidentified victims of the disaster. The ceremony is marked by a haunting toll of bells, 238 rings, one for each life lost, echoing across the peaceful hills in a powerful, auditory memory of the toll. But the remembrance isn't confined to a single day. The city embraced a powerful symbol of renewal, the planting of thousands of new trees along the greenway. For decades, residents have participated in annual tree planting ceremonies, each sapling representing both a life lost and a promise for a safer, greener future. This act of collective healing transformed the landscape from one of barren mud back to one of shaded beauty, ensuring that the legacy of the flood would not be one of perpetual sorrow, but of resilient growth, a forest of living memory standing guard against the river. Amid the shocking images of interstate highways transformed into rivers and portable classrooms set adrift, the Nashville flood of 2010 seemed to target the city's very soul, its music. Yet, in a series of almost miraculous contradictions, the same waters that wrought such devastation also became the unlikely protectors of some of the nation's most priceless musical artifacts, creating preservation stories so bizarre they defy belief. As the Cumberland River swelled and its tributaries burst their banks, the flood sought out the city's lowest points, which tragically included the basements and storage rooms of many iconic music venues and studios. These hidden spaces were the unofficial archives of American music, holding decades of history in the form of master recordings, vintage instruments, and irreplaceable memorabilia. The initial assumption was that this cultural heritage had been utterly destroyed, submerged under feet of foul, chemical-laced water. But as the waters receded and the grim cleanup began, conservators and musicians made a series of astonishing discoveries that bordered on the supernatural. Perhaps the most heart-stopping moment came at the Grand Ole Opry House itself. While the main stage was inundated, the floodwaters had behaved in a peculiarly selective manner. The most sacred artifact in the building, the 6-foot circle of dark oak wood cut from the stage of the original Ryman Auditorium, had been completely submerged. Every country music legend from Hank Williams to Johnny Cash had stood on that circle. To see it waterlogged felt like a profound desecration. Yet, when experts from the Country Music Hall of Fame carefully extracted it, they found that the thick, historical varnish and the dense grain of the aged oak had actually acted as a sealant. The wood was swollen and damaged, but the iconic piece was fundamentally intact, a miracle that allowed for its painstaking restoration and eventual return to its hallowed place, as if the very spirit of the music it had supported had repelled the worst of the damage. This theme of strange preservation extended to the city's legendary recording studios. At Sound Emporium, one of the oldest and most respected studios in town, engineers faced a nightmare. The basement control room, housing a vast collection of vintage analog tape machines and the master recordings for countless hit songs, had been filled to the ceiling. Conventional wisdom stated that magnetic tape was hopeless once wet. The emulsion would dissolve and musical history would be erased into a soup of oxide and plastic. But as they carefully waded into the muck, they found that the very nature of the flood had created an unlikely time capsule. The tapes, stored in tight-fitting boxes and stacked neatly on shelves, had been submerged so quickly and uniformly that silt and mud had actually packed around the boxes, creating an anaerobic seal that prevented oxygen from accelerating decay. While the outer boxes were ruined, hundreds of the precious masters inside were saved through an emergency, round-the-clock rescue operation that involved carefully freezing the tapes to slowly sublimate the moisture away without damaging the fragile magnetic material. It was a bizarre paradox. The mud that symbolized destruction had also acted as a temporary preservative, giving conservators the precious time they needed to work their miracles. Beyond the physical salvage, audio engineers exploring their waterlogged studios began to document a series of strange and previously unrecorded acoustic phenomena. The flood had fundamentally altered the sonic properties of these spaces, which were meticulously designed for perfect sound. Partially flooded rooms created bizarre resonance chambers. In one studio, an engineer noted that the water filling the room to a height of 4 feet had effectively cut the room's volume in half, dramatically shortening the reverberation time and creating a dead, suffocating acoustic effect unlike anything he had ever heard. In other cases, the floodwaters left behind a persistent, eerie dampening effect. The moisture absorbed into the drywall and insulation acted as a permanent sound absorber, robbing the rooms of their former bright, lively ambience and replacing it with a muffled, ghostly silence. The most haunting sonic effects, however, were the ones that lingered after the water was gone. As technicians worked to restore the famed Studio A, they began to hear faint, inexplicable noises, a low, gurgling hum from within the walls that wasn't present on any electrical line, and soft dripping sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, even long after the building was completely dry. Some speculated that these were auditory ghosts, the final echoes of the flood's aqueous symphony trapped within the very structure of the building. Whether a trick of the mind or a genuine physical vibration from still shifting materials, these sounds served as an eerie, permanent reminder of the water's invasion, a subtle acoustic scar on a place dedicated to the creation of perfect sound. The Nashville flood, in its terrible capriciousness, had not only threatened the city's musical heart but had also taught a surreal lesson in resilience, demonstrating that even in the midst of overwhelming loss, stories of strange salvation and unexpected phenomena can emerge, forever changing the sound and soul of the music made there. But if the sheer destructive power of the Texas flood was a stark lesson in the limits of human planning, the event's most lasting legacy wasn't just the wreckage it left behind, it was the bizarre and brilliant wave of innovation it unleashed. The staggering scale of the disaster, particularly the surreal spectacle of the Guadalupe River reversing its flow, made one thing terrifyingly clear: traditional methods of flood control were completely inadequate against nature's most extreme moods. This realization sparked a desperate, frantic search for new solutions, leading engineers to dream up some of the most peculiar and ambitious hydrological experiments ever conceived. One of the most audacious ideas to emerge from the drawing boards was the concept of intentionally engineered river reversal. The phenomenon that had so shocked witnesses, a river overpowered by the sheer volume of its tributaries and forced to flow backward, was seen not just as a freak occurrence but as a potential blueprint. Engineers theorized that if they could not contain a flood, perhaps they could redirect its apocalyptic energy. Plans were drafted for a series of massive, gated diversion channels that would act as pressure release valves during future extreme events. The idea was to intentionally create a controlled version of the reversal, siphoning off a portion of the raging river's flow and diverting it into designated floodways that would carry the water harmlessly away from population centers and back into the river further downstream, in essence giving the flood a safe detour rather than trying to stand in its way. While the full vision was never completely realized due to its colossal cost, elements of this thinking were incorporated into the design of new spillways and bypass channels, a fundamental shift from defiance to strategic concession. This new philosophy also gave birth to one of the most peculiar-looking flood control structures ever built, the labyrinthine weir. Unlike a straight, linear dam, these weirs were designed with a series of zigzagging, tooth-like concrete walls. The bizarre shape wasn't an architectural flourish, it was a stroke of hydraulic genius. During normal flow, water would pass through them with little resistance. But during a flood, the complex geometry would dramatically slow the water's velocity, forcing it to churn and lose energy as it navigated the maze. This effectively turned the weir into a giant shock absorber for the river, taming the torrent's destructive power not by blocking it, but by confusing and wearying it, a strangely elegant solution that worked with the water's own physics. The need for better forecasting sparked equally strange and low-tech innovations in early warning. Realizing that telegraph and telephone lines were among the first casualties of a rising river, officials devised a bizarre but effective relay system using a combination of railroad semaphore signals and giant, painted gauges mounted on bridges. Volunteers, often railroad workers familiar with signal codes, would be stationed upstream to monitor river levels. When the water hit a critical height, they would use flags or lanterns to signal to a counterpart on the next bridge downriver, who would then pass the message along, creating a human chain of visual communication that could outrun the flood itself. In the most remote areas, they even employed a method using simple bottles. A message detailing the river's height and rate of rise would be sealed in a glass bottle and tossed into the current. The hope was that a farmer or fisherman downstream would find it washed up on a bank and have just enough time to sound the alarm in their community, a humble and hopeful message in a bottle against an incoming wall of water. These peculiar, human-centric systems were the awkward, early predecessors of the vast digital sensor networks we rely on today, born from the hard-learned lesson that when technology fails, ingenuity must rise to the occasion. But this immense and prolonged inland sea also triggered a series of profound and often beautiful ecological adaptations, a sudden and massive reorganization of life that turned the catastrophe into a temporary, teeming paradise for some species. The floodwaters inundated millions of acres of farmland and forest, but the highest points in the landscape stubbornly refused to vanish. Hilltops, stretches of highway built on raised causeways, and even the tops of the massive levees themselves were transformed into isolated islands, suddenly the only dry land in a world of water. These scattered refuges became bizarre, crowded arcs of biodiversity, hosting a tense and unprecedented truce between natural enemies. On a single wooded hilltop, observers might find a family of white-tailed deer huddled warily alongside a red fox, while raccoons and opossums shared the higher branches of trees with resting coyotes, all driven to the same tiny sanctuary by the shared, desperate need for dry ground. The air above these islands thrummed with a different kind of life, as the stagnant, warm waters provided the perfect breeding ground for mosquitoes, which hatched in such unimaginable numbers that they formed living, humming clouds so dense they became a genuine health hazard for the stranded creatures below. Perhaps the most dramatic and strangely beautiful spectacle was the mass migration of snakes. As the water swallowed their terrestrial habitats, non-venomous water snakes, rat snakes, and garter snakes were forced to seek the safety of higher ground. They slithered up the bark of trees, coiled on the shingled peaks of suburban rooftops, and draped themselves over the branches of partially submerged bushes in thick, languid knots. In some places, the concentration was so incredibly high that the trees themselves appeared to be alive, their limbs writhing with serpents patiently waiting for the waters to recede. For the human residents battling the flood, it was a deeply unsettling sight, a biblical-scale plague made real. Yet, it was also a powerful testament to the resilience of life and the rapid, unexpected reorganization of entire ecosystems that such a monumental flood could trigger, creating a temporary world where the rules of the forest were rewritten by the necessities of the flood. This prolonged aquatic event also created a bizarre and unexpected bonanza for fish and aquatic birds. The floodwaters effectively expanded their world 100-fold, granting them temporary access to a smorgasbord of terrestrial food sources. Fish species like carp and buffalo fish were seen swimming gracefully through the branches of drowned orchards, nibbling on submerged fruit, while others fanned out across drowned cornfields, feasting on earthworms and insects flushed from the soil. For wading birds like herons and egrets, the flood was a months-long all-you-can-eat buffet. They stalked with deliberate grace through the shallow waters that now covered pastures and parks, enjoying unparalleled success in catching disoriented rodents, amphibians, and insects that had been driven from their homes. The flood, for all its human misery, had accidentally created one of the richest and most expansive wetlands in North American history, a temporary ecological wonder that demonstrated nature's incredible ability to capitalize on disruption and chaos, forging a strange and teeming new world from the waters of destruction. While survivors in the Midwest battled the surreal phenomena of sand boils and crowded animal arks during the prolonged siege of the 1993 flood, a far older and almost mythical deluge had once rewritten the entire map of California, an event so colossal its true scale challenges modern imagination. The California Great Flood of 1862 was a disaster of biblical proportions, a 43-day atmospheric assault that turned the entire Central Valley into a vast inland sea. But beyond the staggering destruction of towns and farms, the flood generated a collection of eyewitness accounts so peculiar they read like passages from a fantastical novel, none more baffling than the widespread reports of aquatic life falling from the heavens. As the relentless rain finally began to subside, newspapers up and down the state began publishing brief, matter-of-fact items that defied all logic. The Sacramento Union reported that in the town of Marysville, a sudden shower had deposited hundreds of perch and sunfish, their bodies slapping against the muddy ground in the town's central plaza. In Sonora, a newspaper editor himself witnessed the event, describing how a brief, intense squall was followed by the sight of dozens of trout, flapping and gasping on the roofs of buildings and in the streets. This bizarre phenomenon, known scientifically as animal rain, has a logical, if no less strange, explanation. The immense stationary storm systems that parked over the state generated incredibly powerful updrafts, capable of sweeping across the newly formed, shallow inland sea that covered the valley. These updrafts acted like nature's vacuum cleaners, sucking up water and anything small swimming within it, including entire schools of fish. Carried aloft within the thunderclouds, these unfortunate aquatic passengers were then transported miles away from their original location. When the atmospheric conditions changed, the rain would fall, and with it the fish deposited far from any recognizable body of water. For the weary, traumatized survivors of the flood, who had already seen their world vanish under a brown ocean, this final surreal touch must have felt like a sign that the very laws of nature had been permanently suspended. It was as if the sky, having already provided far too much water, had decided to furnish the main course as well. The political aftermath of the flood was almost as strange and turbulent as the weather that caused it. The disaster exposed a fatal flaw in the young state's development, its near-total lack of any coordinated water management. The rampant hydraulic mining of the gold rush had already choked rivers with silt, raising their beds and making them more prone to flooding, while farmers had built haphazard levees that often pushed water onto their neighbors' land. The catastrophic failure of this piecemeal approach created a political firestorm. The public was furious and they demanded a scapegoat. Their wrath fell squarely on the state's most powerful industry, the mining companies. Newspapers and political cartoons of the era depicted miners as greedy villains whose operations had directly caused the tragedy, unleashing a wave of popular outrage that threatened to shut down the entire industry. In a desperate bid for survival, the mining interests fought back with a bizarre and cynical political strategy. They launched a massive propaganda campaign, using their considerable wealth to lobby legislators and flood the press with their own version of events. Their argument was as audacious as it was creative. They claimed the flood was not their fault but was instead caused by farmers. They argued that the settlers who had built homes and planted crops on the rich soil of the natural floodplain had invited disaster by being in the water's natural path. It was a stunning attempt to shift blame from the industry that had actively altered the watershed to the victims who had simply tried to build a life on the land. This bitter political battle, fought in the muddy aftermath of the disaster, culminated in a landmark legal decision known as the Code of Civil Procedure, which essentially placed the burden of flood control on private landowners, a stopgap measure that pleased no one and solved nothing. The political chaos, however, did force the state to confront its water problems with a seriousness it never had before. The sheer, overwhelming cost of the flood, 1/4 of the state's economy, was wiped out overnight, and the state government was driven into bankruptcy, made it clear that individual and county-level responses were utterly futile. This collective trauma directly led to the first serious attempts at a state-level water plan. While it would take decades to fully realize, the 1862 flood planted the seed for the concept of a centralized, state-owned water project, an idea that would eventually grow into the vast network of dams, aqueducts, and canals that define California's water system today. The fish falling from the sky were a fleeting, surreal spectacle, but the political and legislative ripples from that flood would shape the destiny of the American West for the next century and a half, proving that a disaster's strangest consequences are not always written in water, but sometimes in law. Yet, even as the peculiar legal framework of the Buffalo Creek disaster was setting new precedents, the testimony that emerged during the hearings painted a picture of the flood itself that was so strange it seemed to defy the laws of physics, adding a layer of surreal horror to the legal proceedings. Survivors called to the stand struggled to articulate the experience, repeatedly describing the wave not as water, but as a living, malevolent force they called black water. Their accounts were less about flowing liquid and more about an aggressive, suffocating solidity. One woman testified that the wave didn't crash into her home. It crawled over it, oozing through every crack and crevice with an almost intelligent persistence. Others spoke of its shocking density, describing how it didn't just push objects but ate them, swallowing houses whole and leaving no trace, and how its bizarre consistency allowed it to carry unimaginably heavy objects like coal trucks and railroad cars with an ease that liquid water never could. This strange behavior was central to the plaintiff's case, and to prove it wasn't hyperbole, they turned to an unlikely field of science, rheology, the study of the flow of matter. Expert witnesses explained that the slurry was a non-Newtonian fluid, a substance that doesn't follow the standard rules of viscosity. Under normal conditions, it was a thick, sludgy liquid. But under the immense sheer force of the dam's collapse, the sudden, catastrophic release of pressure, it underwent a process called shear thinning, momentarily becoming as fluid as water and allowing it to travel with explosive speed. Then, as the wave slowed and spread out, it did the opposite. It shear thickened, becoming more solid and viscous, which explained its terrifying ability to trap victims and its concrete-like final state. This scientific explanation transformed the survivors' seemingly supernatural descriptions into hard, admissible evidence, proving that the wave's unique and deadly properties were a direct, foreseeable result of storing millions of gallons of industrial waste in an unstable dam. The resulting legal settlement was as peculiar and groundbreaking as the disaster itself. Beyond the monetary compensation for property loss and death, the case established the novel legal concept of community trauma as a compensable damage. The plaintiff's lawyers, led by a young and tenacious attorney named Gerald Stern, argued successfully that Pittston's negligence had not merely damaged property, it had annihilated an entire way of life. The close-knit, multi-generational communities of the Hollow were not a collection of individuals but a single social organism, and the flood had shattered its psyche. The settlement awarded damages for this collective emotional distress, a recognition that the loss of neighborly trust, communal cohesion, and shared identity had a real and tangible value. This peculiar clause, born from the black water's peculiar physics, set a revolutionary precedent, expanding the definition of injury in American tort law and paving the way for future class action lawsuits where emotional and societal harm could be weighed alongside physical destruction. Yet, even as the peculiar legal framework of the Buffalo Creek disaster was setting new precedents, the testimony that emerged during the hearings painted a picture of the flood itself that was so strange it seemed to defy the laws of physics, adding a layer of surreal horror to the legal proceedings. Survivors called to the stand struggled to articulate the experience, repeatedly describing the wave not as water, but as a living, malevolent force they called black water. Their accounts were less about flowing liquid and more about an aggressive, suffocating solidity. One woman testified that the wave didn't crash into her home. It crawled over it, oozing through every crack and crevice with an almost intelligent persistence. Others spoke of its shocking density, describing how it didn't just push objects but ate them, swallowing houses whole and leaving no trace, and how its bizarre consistency allowed it to carry unimaginably heavy objects like coal trucks and railroad cars with an ease that liquid water never could. This strange behavior was central to the plaintiff's case, and to prove it wasn't hyperbole, they turned to an unlikely field of science, rheology, the study of the flow of matter. Expert witnesses explained that the slurry was a non-Newtonian fluid, a substance that doesn't follow the standard rules of viscosity. Under normal conditions, it was a thick, sludgy liquid. But under the immense sheer force of the dam's collapse, the sudden, catastrophic release of pressure, it underwent a process called shear thinning, momentarily becoming as fluid as water and allowing it to travel with explosive speed. Then, as the wave slowed and spread out, it did the opposite. It shear thickened, becoming more solid and viscous, which explained its terrifying ability to trap victims and its concrete-like final state. This scientific explanation transformed the survivors' seemingly supernatural descriptions into hard, admissible evidence, proving that the wave's unique and deadly properties were a direct, foreseeable result of storing millions of gallons of industrial waste in an unstable dam. The resulting legal settlement was as peculiar and groundbreaking as the disaster itself. Beyond the monetary compensation for property loss and death, the case established the novel legal concept of community trauma as a compensable damage. The plaintiff's lawyers, led by a young and tenacious attorney named Gerald Stern, argued successfully that Pittston's negligence had not merely damaged property, it had annihilated an entire way of life. The close-knit, multi-generational communities of the Hollow were not a collection of individuals but a single social organism, and the flood had shattered its psyche. The settlement awarded damages for this collective emotional distress, a recognition that the loss of neighborly trust, communal cohesion, and shared identity had a real and tangible value. This peculiar clause, born from the black water's peculiar physics, set a revolutionary precedent, expanding the definition of injury in American tort law and paving the way for future class action lawsuits where emotional and societal harm could be weighed alongside physical destruction. But if the dark, scientific reality of Buffalo Creek was a story of industrial failure, the legend that grew from the floodwaters of Kansas City just 2 decades earlier was a story of surreal survival, a tale that blurred the lines between fact and folklore until it became a permanent part of the city's mythology. The Great Flood of 1951 was a basin-wide catastrophe for the Kansas River system, drowning the industrial West Bottoms district under feet of churning, muddy water. In the immediate chaos, as the water surged into the massive stockyards and packing plants, it unleashed a scene of pure pandemonium. Holding pens became death traps, and panicked animals, driven by primal instinct, began smashing through wooden fences in a desperate bid for survival. Soon, the flooded streets were not just underwater, they were host to a bewildering, swimming stampede. Herds of terrified cattle, their eyes wide with terror, found themselves awkwardly paddling down what had once been busy commercial avenues. Hogs and sheep formed struggling, bleating flotillas pushed along by the current. The air was thick with a dissonant symphony of frightened moos, panicked squeals, and frantic bleating, all mixing with the roar of the water to create a soundscape of utter bedlam. This presented a crisis of bizarre logistics. A 1,500-pound panicked steer is a public menace under the best of circumstances. 1,000 of them swimming through a flooded urban landscape were a genuine threat to rescue operations and public safety. The standard emergency response playbook had no chapter on urban cattle wrangling, so city officials did the only thing that made sense. They put out a call for cowboys. From the surrounding ranches in Kansas and Missouri, ranch hands and rodeo riders answered the call, arriving with their lassos and their skills, only to find their horses useless in the deep, debris-filled water. Without missing a beat, they adapted, trading their saddles for the seats of flat-bottomed john boats commandeered from local marinas. And so began the operation that would cement the flood's place in local legend. The gritty urban canyons of the West Bottoms, normally filled with the smell of manure and industry, were now a hunter-green lake, and these new-age cowboys navigated it with a determined focus. They'd paddle quietly up to a swimming steer, expertly toss a lasso around its neck or horns, and then secure the rope to their boat. The sight of a small aluminum boat puttering along, towing a massive, swimming bovine behind it like a water skier, became a common and utterly bizarre image. Some of the more agile cowboys would even leap from their boats onto the backs of calmer animals, riding them through the flooded streets to guide them toward sections of higher ground or makeshift corrals set up on railroad embankments that now functioned as islands. From these true and documented events, the legend of the swimming cattle was born and began to grow in the city's collective imagination. Over the decades, the story has been retold and embellished, transforming from a unique emergency response into a full-blown tall tale. In one popular version, a particularly clever cowboy supposedly lassoed a large bull from his boat, only to have the animal suddenly dive, pulling the entire boat underwater with him, with both cowboy and steer miraculously popping back up moments later, none the worse for wear. Another oft-repeated story tells of a famous rodeo champion who was brought in and, in a spectacular feat of skill, roped 2 steers at once from a single moving boat, tying the ropes off to a submerged streetlight. These stories, while almost certainly apocryphal, serve a powerful purpose in the city's mythology. They transform a narrative of terrifying loss and destruction into one of humorous resilience and Midwestern resourcefulness. The image of the cowboy in a boat is a potent symbol, representing a defiant willingness to meet a bizarre and unprecedented challenge with whatever tools and talents were at hand. It's a story the city tells itself about itself, that no matter how high the water rises, Kansas City will always find a way to adapt, to innovate, and to rope the chaos both literally and figuratively. The floodwaters eventually receded, the mud was cleaned, and the buildings were repaired, but the legend of the swimming cattle and their aquatic wranglers never left. It remains a peculiar and enduring testament to how communities process trauma, not just through grief and rebuilding, but through the creation of stories that add a layer of heroic and sometimes hilarious myth over the stark reality of disaster. From the bizarre to the tragic, the surreal to the scientifically inexplicable, these 31 stories are far more than just a catalogue of disasters. They form a mosaic of the American experience with water, a force that both gives life and with terrifying unpredictability can reshape it in an instant. What unites these events is not just the element of water, but the incredible spectrum of human response it provokes. We've seen communities drowned in molasses and choked by coal slurry, watched as houses became lifeboats and steamships navigated city streets, and witnessed cowboys in boats and pianos turned into rafts. In every instance, the human spirit has been tested, and in the most remarkable ways it has adapted, creating moments of breathtaking ingenuity, heartbreaking loss, and profound resilience. These narratives remind us that our relationship with nature is not a simple battle for control, but a complex and often humbling negotiation. We build mighty dams declared flood-proof, only to watch them pivot and vanish. We channel rivers in concrete, only to later yearn for their natural beauty. We settle on floodplains, forgetting the ancient paths of the water, and are shocked when it seeks to reclaim them. These floods are stark lessons in humility, teaching us that for all our engineering and technology, we are still subject to the immense, raw power of the natural world. They are powerful correctives to the idea that we have fully tamed our environment, revealing that just beneath the surface of our modern cities and ordered landscapes lies a potential for chaos that can rewrite the rules in a matter of minutes. Yet, the legacy of these events is not written solely in water and mud, but in law, in art, in community memory, and in the very infrastructure of our nation. The Buffalo Creek disaster redefined corporate accountability. The Johnstown flood exposed the deadly cost of privileging private luxury over public safety. The Great Flood of 1993 revolutionized our approach to floodplains, teaching us that sometimes the wisest course of action is to simply get out of the water's way. From each tragedy, a lesson was carved, however painfully, into the national consciousness, leading to safer building codes, better warning systems, and a deeper, more respectful understanding of the waters that surround us. Ultimately, these stories are a testament to the fact that truth is, and always will be, stranger than fiction. No screenwriter could conjure the image of sharks stranded in Los Angeles streets, or a river flowing backward, or a wave of black coal waste crawling through a mountain hollow. These events challenge our understanding of the possible and force us to expand our definition of reality. They are reminders that history is filled with chapters so peculiar, so utterly unexpected, that they surpass our wildest imaginations. So the next time you see a rain cloud gathering or walk along a riverbank, remember the incredible power and profound strangeness that water holds, and the astonishing stories of destruction, survival, and renewal that are always waiting just beneath the surface. Which of these 31 incredible stories stuck with you the most? Was it the surreal horror of Boston's Molasses tsunami, the eerie premonitions before Johnstown's wall of water, or the bizarre sight of sharks swimming through the streets of Los Angeles? Maybe it was the sheer, terrifying power that made a river flow backward in Texas, or the tragic, avoidable negligence that unleashed a wave of black death in Buffalo Creek. Every single one of these events is a powerful reminder of nature's unpredictability and the incredible resilience of the human spirit in the face of the utterly bizarre. We want to hear from you. Dive into the comments and share your own local flood legends. Every region has its own stories of high water and strange happenings, and your personal connection might just be the most fascinating tale we've heard yet. For more deep dives into the forgotten, the peculiar, and the unbelievable corners of American history, make sure you're part of our community. Hit that subscribe button and don't forget to ring the notification bell. That's the best way to ensure you're with us for our next adventure into the weird and wonderful.